Today on Point of the Spear.
One of the things that had really occurred to me over the years is that one of the last kind of unexplored aspects of World War II from an American standpoint was the Army's experience in the Pacific. I noticed that there was this kind of mythology or sort of misconception, maybe is a better word, all these years later, that when it came to the ground fighting in the Pacific, that the Marines had really done the ground fighting, the Navy did everything else, and the Army focused on Europe, and that couldn't have been more untrue.
Esteemed military historian John McManus is here to talk about his new book on the Pacific War, and we'll hear from him right after this break. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Welcome back. Today's guest is one of America's leading military historians and a recipient of the prestigious Gilder Lehrman Prize for Military History. He is an in-demand speaker and expert commentator on CNN, Fox News, Discovery, Smithsonian Network, and more. His latest book is called Island Infernos, the U.S. Army's Pacific War Odyssey, 1944. And author John McManus joins us now. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rob.
You're very welcome. The book is getting a lot of high praise. Congratulations, sir.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's the second in a trilogy that I'm doing about the Army in the Pacific, so I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, I read that it is the second installment. And what were your reasons to dive into the Pacific War? Was there a compelling reason to go into that?
Yeah, as a primarily World War II historian, although I've done more than just that, but that has been to a great extent the focus of a lot of my books. You're always thinking about original sides of the war that haven't really been explored the way they should be, and especially for me as a again a kind of a primarily U.S. historian. One of the things that had really occurred to me over the years is that one of the last kind of unexplored aspects of World War II from an American standpoint was the Army's experience in the Pacific. I noticed that there was this kind of mythology or sort of misconception, maybe is a better word, all these years later, that when it came to the ground fighting in the Pacific, that the Marines had really done the ground fighting, the Navy did everything else, and the Army focused on Europe, and that couldn't have been more untrue. 1.8 million American ground soldiers served in the Pacific in World War II. It's the third largest army we've ever sent overseas to fight a war. So I knew there was a massive story there, and then that could tell us a lot more about the Pacific War, and I think really a lot of subsequent history ever since.
Yeah, there is that impression that the Marines did all the fighting in the Pacific. That impression is there. How would you compare the intensity of the combat in the jungles of the Pacific as opposed to the forests of Europe?
It may even be. I mean, it was pretty intense in Europe, of course, and I wouldn't downplay that. But I think perhaps it's even more intense in the war against Japan. In the many jungles where this war is fought, and the terrible wildernesses where a lot of this was going on, and cave warfare. And one of the reasons for the greater intensity is that I think, as you may know, that many of the Japanese simply elected to fight to the death. And so it really wasn't like, you outflank a group of enemy and they know they're kind of checkmated and they lay down their arms and they go into a POW cage like often happened in Europe. Here in the Pacific, what I compare it to is it's as if you've got a shattered mirror and you police up most of the big, pieces of the shattered mirror, but there's always these jagged edges out there. And a lot of Pacific theater battles are like that, in the sense that the Americans have won what they want, an air base or an island or a harbor or whatever it is. But there's still Japanese out there who are determined to resist. And so you constantly have to deal with those jagged edges of Japanese resistance, many of whom have been outflanked too, during the island hopping.
Did you find that was the case with the Japanese through the end of the war, even though they, towards the end, it was clear that they weren't going to win the war, or did they ever accept that?
You're seeing a kind of a mixture toward the end of the war. Certainly many Japanese fighting to the death, most famously, of course, on Okinawa, where many are just fighting to the bitter end, including, of course, the Japanese commander, General Ushijima. You're seeing some of that in the Philippines, but by the mid late summer 1945, when it is becoming clear, at least to some Japanese, that the war is about over, you are starting to see some surrenders, some larger mass surrenders. So, for instance, but according to the records that I found, the U.S., I think, like by the end of 1944, had maybe like 4,000 Japanese military or POWs in custody or something. At Okinawa alone, we take 7,400. By the end of June and into July. In the Philippines, of course, many more. So you're seeing a little bit of a mixture in that regard, that the dams were opening toward the end, but also too, I think, as many of us know famously, some of these guys were unreconciled to it and were in the jungles for years. The last guy surrendered in Guam in 1972. So you sort of have that too.
Yeah, I've read those stories where they walk out into the modern day era, and they don't know.
Right, and they're like, "What am I looking at here?" I mean, post VJ Day, it was a major operation, not just for the U.S. but for the Allies, to get Japanese soldiers to lay down their arms wherever they were. It could be Manchuria, it could be other parts of China, jungles in the South Pacific, the Dutch East Indies, Philippines. There were, well over 1 million Japanese military personnel who are going to surrender in that 6 to 12 month period. And that was a big effort.
Was there ever an order to stand down that was issued to them?
There is. It's coming from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. And of course, some commanders don't want to believe it, or perhaps resist it, or reluctant to comply for whatever reason. But more commonly, once they got that directive, they are going to stand down, and they felt that, okay, well then, our honor is still clean because the emperor himself, through Imperial General Headquarters, has told us to do this, and so now it's okay. And of course, famously, this applies to General Yamashita in the Philippines, who fights to the bitter end on Luzon, and only comes out of the jungle, once he gets that imperial directive.
Yeah, it was amazing. Some reviewers have said, or several have mentioned, that you've given much needed attention to black soldiers in the Pacific War. Did you find that their stories were being untold?
I think sort of lost in the mix more than untold, that they were there for the taking, but I think, maybe it's better to have a kind of 21st century perspective on this, having seen where the civil rights movement went after World War II, and the struggles many African American soldiers had during and after the war. I think that it allows us as latter-day historians to have that kind of perspective advantage. So, I do cover the experiences of African American soldiers in a significant amount of depth, especially on Bougainville, where a lot of the sort of racial drama plays out. You have an African American infantry division, the 93rd, that's sort of introduced to combat there. And unlike pretty much every other unit in the U.S. Army, they don't get the opportunity to just sort of find their way in combat, make mistakes, learn what they're doing and move on. They are sort of this sort of, example of all black soldiers kind of thing. And so you can see the divide in America at that point in time between the pro-segregation sort of racism crowd and the civil rights crowd, who are battling very much politically in Washington. So the 93rd becomes kind of if you're for or against. If you're for, you're trumpeting any kind of accomplishment that they have, saying these guys are great, see, this shows segregation is bad. And then if you're against any mistake they make, we'll see, black soldiers won't fight and all this. Yeah. And tragically, it's the latter view that prevails when there's a fiasco of a patrol, and which, by the way, happens to most every unit in the introduction to combat, and it happens to this unit, and that happens. So, but this became a kind of larger kind of political football, and so black soldiers were largely consigned to non-combat duty, unloading ships, engineers to build things and maintain the bases, and this was true until mostly the end of the war in the Philippines, where it was starting to change a little bit. But so you see that kind of undercurrent of racial tension there within this larger American war effort, and I think there's some really good lessons to take from that.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Next time, my guest will be author and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Ed Sherwood, discussing his book, Courage Under Fire.
These were not Viet Cong irregular soldiers. These were well-trained, well-disciplined, well-equipped North Vietnamese Army regulars. And they were in a bunker complex about the size of an American football field, if you can imagine. Over 15 or 16 bunkers with mutual supporting fires and heavy vegetation. And they let us walk right into that.
That's next time. Thanks for listening to the program. I hope you'll support our guests by clicking on the book purchase link in this episode's description. Each purchase helps support local bookstores, and that's always a good thing. That sounds a lot like the experience of the 92nd in Italy, where they initially were assigned, perimeter duty and non-combat roles until they were actually needed because they didn't have a replacement duty.
Right. And that's a great point, Rob, because it's so similar. The only difference I would say of the 93rd is they're the beneficiaries of better leadership. In the 92nd, Ned Allman, you couldn't have picked a worse division commander for an African American unit. Fortunately, the 93rd has has a general named Johnson and another one named Boyd, who are very pro integration and generally pro African American soldiers, and they're like advocates. But even then, the larger powers that be aren't always putting it on the record, but it's clear they don't really want to get involved in the race issue, and they don't want the black soldiers there. And so it also gives us an insight in the fact that the Americans can afford to sidetrack quality combat manpower, and still somehow win this war. It's embarrassing in a way and sad, but it also shows you the kind of American largesse that's there too, that you can afford to kind of waste this human capital. A lot of soldiers who were well-trained and willing to fight that were not making use of them, even in the bitter end in the Philippines in some cases.
Yeah, I know the 93rd came from mainly Fort Huachuca in Arizona, right?
Right.
They were trained there. 1944 was a pivotal year in the Pacific War. What, in your view, was the battle that turned the tide?
Yeah, I think I see 1944 as a kind of pivot point. I think the tide of the war overall had turned earlier, like during Guadalcanal and Buna and Midway. I think in 1944, really the key battles are fought in the Marianas. What Normandy is to Europe in terms of like a pivot point to final victory, and the beginning of the end for Germany, the Marianas in the summer 1944 are for Japan. And the reason is when the U.S. takes Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, the U.S. is now going to have air bases from which to bomb the Japanese home islands. And that'll happen, by the end of 1944. And that's really kind of the game changer that now brings the war to Japanese shores in a very, very destructive and meaningful way, ultimately with fire bombings and whatever else. That begins with the Marianas campaign. It also breaks the back of the Imperial Navy to some extent because of U.S. naval victories, and completely crushes some ground formations that the Japanese could not afford to lose, primarily on Guam and Saipan in major battles. So I cover those in a great deal of depth.
I see. What were some of the lessons America took from the Pacific War, do you believe?
Yeah, I mean, you see these long-term harbingers. For one thing, the brutality of the fighting really characterizes pretty much all American wars ever since. We tend to face enemies that don't follow the same rules of warfare that we think we want to follow, and are followed more often than not in Europe, I would say, just as a general rule of thumb. Well, in the Pacific, you don't see that. For instance, the Japanese are shooting medics anytime they can, and happy to do it. And that's going to be true for the North Koreans and the Chinese in Korea. It's going to be true for the Viet Cong and the NVA. It's going to be true in Desert Storm and in the 21st Century Wars, and this idea of rules of warfare. And so it forces the Americans to kind of grapple themselves with what are their own rules of warfare, their rules of engagement, what do they stand for. So there's that. There's a kind of a special operations legacy that you see because you're battling for cultural influence in so many places, like Burma, like China, like the Philippines, many other places around the Pacific. So you're seeing American soldiers perform in missions that are similar to what special forces are going to do later. You see the importance of working with allies, and even culturally similar allies like Australia and Britain. There are major disagreements and problems, much less Chiang Kai-shek in China.
Right.
And I really think in some ways that's the most tragic lesson not learned in a way is how to have influence in China and the importance of China relative to the rest of the war. And obviously it doesn't turn out the way the Americans would have hoped on any level.
Right. Now, Island Infernos is the second book in the series, and it was a trilogy, wasn't it? It was planned as a trilogy, and I've read places where this is the final book in the series. Is that correct?
No, this is the second book. So the first book was called Fire and Fortitude, and it covers 1941 to 43. So I start with Pearl Harbor, and I end with the invasion of Macon in November of 43 by the 27th Division. Island Infernos begins at the beginning of 1944 and ends with that year. So we begin in the Battle of Kwajalein in January, February, and then we end with Leyte, with the invasion and subsequent Battle of Leyte, October to about the end of 1944, though fighting lingered on for months in 45 too. But so in between, you just see there's this sense of this kind of growing American power. By 1944, the Army had become an incredibly sophisticated and complex and professional and potent military force. And it's in 1944 that you really see this start to play out as American power globally begins to expand. And of course, obviously Normandy is the prime example of that in Europe, but you're seeing much the same thing in the Pacific with MacArthur's campaigns from the Admiralties and the invasion of Hollandia, and then subsequently on to Biak, and then, of course, the Philippines, and then in the Central Pacific from Kwajalein all the way through to, obviously, the Marianas, and then Peleliu and all this kind of. So it's just there's so many balls the planners are juggling, and this takes massive American military power to pull this off. So
the third book in the series, what is that titled?
It's tentatively titled To the End of the Earth, and it'll cover 1945, so the end of the war. So it's chronological in that sense. So Island Infernos covers exclusively 1944, and of course it's reprising many of the same individuals whom we've looked at in Fire and Fortitude, most notably General MacArthur or General Eichelberger, but also POWs. So I cover the POW experience in all three books. Of what that was like, horrible experience, of course. And I focus on four primary individuals. General Wainwright, of course, who was the ranking prisoner. Harold K. Johnson, who was more at the mid-level and one day is Army Chief of Staff, but he's a remarkable field grade figure in that era. And then two enlisted soldiers, a guy named Lester Tenney, who was a tanker, and is captured, and another guy named Michael Campbell, who was an infantry soldier. So again, it's like anything through these three books, you see these various individuals in the course of the Pacific War.
How much do you get into some of the naval engagements? Because I did a documentary several years ago on the USS Franklin, and that was obviously hit in 1945, March. Do you touch upon any naval engagements? I know this is about the Army.
I do, and most notably the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which of course dramatically impacts the Battle of Leyte itself. Obviously, that's an air-land-sea battle in the same fashion that Guadalcanal had been. So what happens on October 24th to say 26th at sea certainly impacts MacArthur's operations on land and the Japanese too. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I have the kind of in-depth treatment of battles like Leyte Gulf that you could get from really proper naval historians like Ian Toll. But I do link it to these ground operations because, what I hope the reader comes away with is a sense of how interdependent the services are. That the Army isn't going anywhere without the Navy. And, obviously the Pacific War is a naval war to some extent and an air war to get air bases and all that. But in the end, some poor schlub had to fight and win on the ground. And that's where we're creating our logistical base of support and all of these other factors that are coming into play, what I would say almost like human factors. So what I do is I take the naval battles into account far enough that we can get a good understanding of how that impacts the ground battles too, and maybe vice versa.
The book is called Island Infernos, the U.S. Army's Pacific War, Odyssey, 1944. John, thank you so very much for being on the show. This has been great.
Yeah. Rob, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. Next time, my guest will be author and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Ed Sherwood, discussing his book, Courage Under Fire.
These were not Viet Cong irregular soldiers. These were well-trained, well-disciplined, well-equipped North Vietnamese Army regulars. And they were in a bunker complex about the size of an American football field, if you can imagine. Over 15 or 16 bunkers with mutual supporting fires and heavy vegetation. And they let us walk right into that.
That's next time. And if you like what you hear, leave a review or a rating or just click the follow button. You can find me on Twitter @RobChild, where you can share your comments about the show. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.
I wanted to take a moment to thank our growing army of listener supporter members. You make it possible to continue our mission of bringing you the best military history authors, filmmakers, and movers and shakers. If you're not a member yet, it's easy to join, and it takes just seconds. Scroll down to the bottom of this episode's description and click the support link. You'll come to our anchor page, click the support button, complete the brief form. It's that easy. We're planning loyalty perks and giveaways to roll out over the coming months for our early supporters who sign on before the end of the year. So don't wait, become a member today, and thank you for your support.